Maybe you've met people who seem cold, distant, hard to reach. Or maybe you've recognized yourself in this. We look at how others react and we're quick to judge them. We say they're complicated, hard to love. But what if we looked a bit deeper? What if we tried to understand what truly happened inside them long before all these walls were built? Today I want to talk about how pain changes us. About how sometimes what looks like coldness is just fear. And what seems like indifference is simply a quiet way of surviving. I invite you to listen with an open heart. Maybe you'll understand someone you care about a little better. Maybe you'll understand yourself. Let's walk through this story together. Some people seem cold, distant, hard to love, but in reality they're just trying not to get hurt again. Pain changes the way we exist, and the hardest part, almost no one notices. When pain isn't understood, it hides and shows up in our behavior. People who've been through deep suffering don't act that way for no reason. They've learned to survive in their own way, and sometimes they don't even know why they react the way they do. Some aren't cold, they've just closed themselves off too tightly. Others aren't hard to love, they've simply learned to fear love. Many behaviors we call distance, harshness, or being complicated are actually ways the soul tries not to feel what once hurt too badly. When pain has no space to be felt, it turns into defense. And over time, these defenses start to feel like part of us. But they're not. They're just armor, quietly woven, thread by thread, from the instinct to stay whole. They say pain is the price the soul pays to finally see itself more clearly. Deep pain, when listened to with respect, shows us not only where we're wounded, but also where we've forgotten how to truly live. In this way, deep suffering shapes behaviors that aren't always from our natural character, but from trying to keep the soul standing even among ruins. People who've carried a lot of pain build complex psychological mechanisms hidden deep inside, sometimes even from their own thoughts. The way they react, protect themselves, or withdraw is not random. It's layered, built long ago to keep old wounds from opening again. Judging these behaviors is like seeing a scar and forgetting the wound that came before it. But there's another way of looking, a way that doesn't ask, "What's wrong with you?" but instead, "What happened to you?" That perspective changes everything. Because it starts to turn suffering into understanding. It sees clues, a kind of map, in our reactions. The mind speaks through repetition, through patterns, through tiny symbols. And every reaction that seems too much might just be the echo of an old pain begging to be seen. A wounded soul doesn't seek pity. It just wants to be seen. And being seen with kindness is the first step to stop reacting on autopilot and start truly listening. When we understand that pain shapes us but doesn't define us, we can slowly begin to take off the armor that once felt like our own skin. And in place of that stiffness appears a space, still fragile but real, where we start to touch what used to only defend itself. Some pain doesn't go away. It settles inside us and builds a nest there. And if it's not welcomed, it turns into living cores that keep reacting even long after the danger has passed. These are like emotional structures with a life of their own. They're not bad in themselves. They're just how the soul learned to carry what would have been impossible to bear otherwise. Picture someone who was deeply rejected as a child. Maybe it wasn't obvious. Sometimes it's just silence, absence, looks that said more than words. That unspoken wound becomes a knot of rejection. Years later, this person reacts strongly to anything that feels like distance, a cold reply, a delayed message, a neutral face. They're not exaggerating. That's the wound speaking, with the same force as when it first opened. We all have these knots. The problem is when they start to control us. When they're triggered, they take over. and we enter a state we often don't even understand ourselves. We might cry for no reason, burst out, suddenly shut down, or feel a huge emptiness over small things. These reactions aren't irrational. They make complete sense inside someone who's carried so much pain. It's easy to go years believing you're too complicated, too sensitive, too reactive. But the truth is, these structures are like alarms. They go off when something in the present unconsciously reminds us of the past. Even if the mind can't connect the dots right away, they don't just vanish because we wish them to. They start to shift only when they're acknowledged. It all begins with an honest listening inside. What part of me needs care right now? Where is this reaction coming from? What is this pain trying to protect? Truly seeing doesn't erase these cores, but it takes away their silent power. They're not flaws, they're memories that still hurt. When we learn to listen to them without fear or judgment, they stop screaming. They start to whisper. And in that whisper, the soul begins to settle differently. Not to forget what happened, but to build a place where pain no longer reacts alone, but is finally cared for. Distrust isn't a lack of warmth, it's just a way of surviving. For someone who was hurt right where they felt safest, trusting again isn't simple, it's a risk. A risk the mind, trying to protect, has learned to avoid. Even when things seem safe, the soul stays alert, because inside it doesn't tell the difference between now and then. It just feels the pattern and reacts. This constant state of alert is how it learned to respond to a world that at some point stopped feeling safe. Maybe because of a betrayal, a broken bond, a big absence of affection. It doesn't matter how big the event was. What matters is the wound it left behind. When distrust takes root, the mind builds invisible walls. It studies looks, silences, predicts disappointment before it comes, and if it doesn't find real signs, it often imagines them, just to avoid being caught off guard again. People who live like this don't do it because they want to, but even less do they want to feel again what once hurt so badly. Distrust becomes a filter. Through it pass words, gestures, even love. Everything is weighed, tested, and often pushed away, because it feels safer to keep people at a distance than to believe and be hurt again. None of this comes from malice, but from fear. The mind learned that trust costs, but over time this protection has a price too. You can't feel real closeness if you're always waiting to be hurt. Healing begins when you see you're reacting to what was, not what is. When you realize the fear isn't about the present, but about an old echo still beating inside. It takes courage to pause that inner alarm, even for a moment, and ask, is this really a threat or just a memory leading me? Trust doesn't mean tearing down all defenses at once. It means allowing small tests of reality, seeing that the present can be different, and that the person in front of you isn't to blame for wounds left by someone else. Distrust isn't a mistake, it's a response. But when the soul understands, it's no longer at war. It can slowly start to rest. There are moments when the world seems to collapse from within. Trust breaks, bonds feel like threats, and pain is the only companion left. In those moments, isolation isn't a choice, it's instinct. The wounded soul withdraws just like a hurt body pulls away from touch, not out of pride, not to manipulate, but because any closeness feels dangerous. It closes up, builds walls, goes silent. From the outside, this looks like coldness, indifference, distance. But inside, it's clear. At first, isolation is a kind of shelter, a place where the soul tries to gather itself after being torn apart. There, in the dark, it tries to find its shape again, now that the world no longer feels safe. This turning inward is like a small death followed by a rebirth. The shadow folds in, not because it's given up, but because it needs to protect itself until it can breathe again. And sometimes silence is the only language left for someone still learning how to name their pain. But what started as a refuge can become a prison over time. What was once a pause becomes a pattern. What was protection becomes chronic isolation. And then what once saved starts to suffocate. The soul learns not to lean on anyone. And the heart, though it beats, ends up living locked behind doors no one has the key to anymore. When you start to see what you carry inside, something shifts. There's no need to rush, but there is a need for truth. To admit, yes, I pulled back so I could keep going, but maybe now I don't have to be alone all the time. Then slowly the walls begin to soften. Isolation turns into a bearable quiet, where being alone no longer means being cut off from life. And there, reconnection becomes possible. With yourself, with others, with life. Not like before, but more real. Because those who've retreated deeply know best when at last it's safe to open the door again, even if just a little. Step by step. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Maybe some words touched places you keep well hidden. Maybe they just brought a bit of calm. Either way, it's a beginning. Because seeing what you carry inside without running from it is already a big step. If you feel like it, leave me a sign in the comments. Just write, "I'm learning to listen to my pain." That tells me you're not alone on this path. And maybe one day we'll all understand a little better that beneath every wall there's a person still learning how to be alive. We'll meet again soon.